Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on something that keeps our modern world ticking: security risk management. We're going to break down how the pros protect all sorts of valuable information, from top corporate secrets all the way down to your own personal data. So let's just jump right in with a question. What do you think is the biggest threat to an organization's data? Is it some hacker hunched over a keyboard in a dark room? An employee who makes an honest mistake? Maybe a natural disaster? See, before we can even start building up our defenses, we have to know what we're up against. And the answer might not be what you think. Okay, let's dive in. Here's the game plan for this explainer. First, we'll figure out what we're even protecting in the first place. Then, we'll dissect what risk is actually made of, see how the professionals analyze it, tackle the tricky part of how to measure it, and we'll wrap it all up with a simple 4-step action plan. First things first, what's the end goal here? Because it's not just about stopping hackers. See, it all comes down to protecting these three kind of like core principles of information. These are the absolute crown jewels of information security. So what the experts call this is the CIA triad. Confidentiality, that's all about keeping secrets secret. If that breaks, boom, data breach. Then there's integrity, making sure data is accurate and can be trusted. If that fails, financial records could get messed with. And finally, availability. This just means the data is there when you need it. If that fails, a website could crash right in the middle of a huge sale. These three, they're the foundation for everything else. All right, so now we know what we're trying to protect. Let's get into the language of risk. And to really get this, we've got to break it down into its most basic parts. It all starts with something called an asset. An asset is just anything that has value and needs to be protected. It could be the servers in your office, that big customer database, heck, even the contact list on your own phone. It's the treasure we're trying to guard. Next up, you've got the threat. A threat is any potential harm that could happen to that asset. So if your asset is your house, the threat is the burglar who wants to get in. It's the what could go wrong part of the story. Okay, so how does that threat actually become a problem? Well, it happens through a vulnerability. A vulnerability is basically a weakness, a gap in your defenses. Going back to our house, the vulnerability is that unlocked window, the one the burglar can just slide right open. And this is the key, right? You put all those pieces together, that's risk. Risk is the actual chance of a threat, like our burglar, successfully using a vulnerability, like that unlocked window, to cause damage to an asset, which is your stuff. And this image, wow, it just lays out the whole framework perfectly. You can see right here how the asset, the threat, and the vulnerability all come together to create the risk. Then, the whole other half of the job, management, is about putting security measures in place to knock that risk down to a level we can live with. Okay, let's keep going. Let's see how this whole idea turns into an actual, formal process. Because the pros, they don't just guess at this stuff. They have a real methodology, with clear goals. So the goals of this whole analysis are pretty straightforward, but they cover a lot of ground. First, you got to identify every single asset. Then, you list out all the possible threats. After that, you find all the vulnerabilities. And finally, you figure out the potential cost and impact if something bad actually happens. It's kind of like making a super detailed map of your kingdom, its treasures, and all its weak spots before you even think about building the walls. Okay, so that all sounds pretty logical, right? But here's where it gets a little tricky. That last step, figuring out the cost. Well, it's not simple math. Because trying to put an exact price tag on risk, way harder than it sounds. I mean, really think about it. How much is a company's reputation worth in dollars? What's the price of customer trust? These are what we call intangible assets. They're incredibly valuable for sure, but they don't have a price tag you can look up. And that makes calculating risk with just money almost impossible. And what's so smart about this is the solution. So instead of getting bogged down in what they call false precision, trying to pin an exact dollar amount on something you can't predict, the pros aim for practical clarity. The whole idea is to talk about risk in a way that everyone gets and can actually do something about. Right, so instead of messing with dollars and cents, a lot of pros just use a simple scale. They'll just classify the potential hit as high, medium, or low. A high-impact risk would be a total game changer for the organization, while the low-impact one is something you could probably handle without too much trouble. Super simple, clear, and it actually works. All right, let's put this all together. We're going to wrap this up with a super clear 4-step action plan that gives you a solid framework to work from. Here's the playbook. First up, you define your scope. What are we actually looking at here? Then you identify your assets inside that scope. After that, you find the threats that could hurt those assets. And finally, you pinpoint the vulnerabilities that those threats could use against you. And let's zoom in on step 2 for a second, identifying assets. This is so important. You have to think beyond just the physical stuff. I mean, sure, you've got hardware and software, but think about it. Your data, your people, and especially those intangibles like your company's reputation, a lot of times that's the most valuable stuff.
You know, this quote just nails it. It really gets to the heart of the whole process. It's not about just guessing. It's about systematically figuring out the risk by really understanding the connection between what you have, what could hurt it, and where you're weak. And hey, this whole framework, it's not just for giant corporations. You can use this exact same thinking to protect what's important to you, from your own financial data to your privacy online. So I'll leave you with this to think about. Now that you've got the framework, what's the first thing in your world you'd want to analyze and protect?